powerful, and I saw it when it first came out. It first came out October 2015, and as Mary is saying, of course, that was a different time. We seem to have had the sea change now, which is quite extraordinary and very fast. And right, I mean, maybe it's now being looked at differently. It's just been on television. When it came out, there were a lot of criticisms of it, which by feminists, which I found rather depressing, because I think the main problem is that because there are so few films about this subject, I mean, there hasn't been any except in the 70s there was a series on television called Shoulder to Shoulder, which is also about WSP, which I haven't actually seen, but I mean, since then there's been nothing, and then along comes this film, and it has to sort of represent everything. And it's, I mean, this is the problem when you have the one film, and it has to carry all the arguments. And so I just want to go through some of the criticisms that were put and try and address those and say, well, I think actually those criticisms are unfair. So there was a criticism from the States immediately, because, you know, when you've got Emily Pankhurst, Meryl Streep, coming out on the balcony, her final words are, "Better to be a rebel than a slave." And when this film was premiered, a lot of women had T-shirts with this slogan across it. And a lot of Americans were absolutely furious with this. But of course it had quite a different resonance in the States. And they were furious because said a rebel in the States meant you were a Confederate from the southern states. So it has a different meaning. It doesn't mean that in this country. And also, they said, you can't talk about slavery, that's black slavery, it's disrespectful to black women. But, you know, if you think of the context, the British context, the term slave was used widely at that time in reference to wage workers, domestic workers, and indeed sex workers, with the idea of white slavery. So I think if you see it in the context of Britain in that Edwardian period, that slogan, you know, was said, and it did have resonance. So I think we can discount that criticism. I mean, this is a problem, you know, when you come at it without that historical understanding. And I'm surprised that Meryl Streep, you know, the one American in the cast, was not aware of that possible reaction. Other criticisms has been that there was no representation of the NUWSS, the non-violent, the suffragists, okay, the non-militants, on the one hand, and also another criticism was that there was no representation of women of colour. Taking that latter criticism first, while there were known to have been at least 2 Indian women in the WSPU at the time, one was Princess Sophia Duleep Singh, who was the Queen Victoria's goddaughter, in fact, about whom there's a TV programme very soon, apparently. And the other was someone called Bikaji Kama, who was an active feminist and daughter of a well-known Indian lawyer. There were, in fact, very few black or Asian women involved in suffrage. There may indeed have been 1 or 2 women of colour working in the laundries, but they would have been very few in number. So I think that's, again, not very fair to lay that criticism at the feet of the filmmakers. So what about the criticism that it's just about the WSPU again? I mean, this is the one thing people know about the suffragettes. And what about the NUWSS, the law-abiding suffragists? Why were they sidelined? Again, I think it's this problem of assuming that one film can represent all aspects of an issue. And, I mean, what's so unique about this film is that rather than, as Mary says, rather than centering on the key figures, the Pankhursts, it takes a so-called ordinary working-class woman and shows how, you know, she's ground down, she had been up to that point non-political, she is very involved in her family life, and then she becomes politicised, and you see it through her eyes, and you hear her words. I mean, I think those are hugely moving and powerful, and I think, you know, it's so rare to get that voice. Just one last point I want to make about this debate that's been going on about whether the suffragettes should be posthumously pardoned. I know you've all heard this, yes? And they're saying, oh yes, we should do this. Now actually, I think, you may disagree, but I think that's quite a patronising view of the suffragettes. It's a kind of denial that they were in civil disobedience. I don't think they'd want to be pardoned. They were proud of having broken windows and making a scene, making a spectacle of themselves. That's what they wanted to do, drawing attention to the cause. You pardon people for miscarriages of justice. The miscarriage of justice was that women didn't have the vote in the first place, and it took so long for them to get it. So I think it's rather missing the point to say they should be pardoned. I think that this film has raised awareness of the issues, has led to so much debate, and that can only be a very good thing. And I hope it will lead to many other films on the themes of women's suffrage. And perhaps the next one will actually look at the radical suffragists in, say, the north of England, as opposed to London and the south. Thank you.
Hi, I actually have very little to add, except to say that I'm perhaps slightly less carried away by the film than the rest of the panel. Partly because I find the manipulativeness of the fiction slightly problematic. Many working class activists were involved in struggling for the vote, and they have fantastic stories. So if you wanted to dramatise something of the past, you could have taken one of those, the mill workers. Is it Dorothy Thewlis? I don't remember, the baby suffragette she was known as. She demonstrated, was photographed, and her photograph frequently reproduced at the age of 16 when she came down to London, a deputation of mill workers. And there are others. The most famous is probably Annie Kenny, who with her sister was actively involved as an organiser of the WSPU. And I suppose my unease about the fictional story of our two heroines, and they're magnificently acted and portrayed, and the reenactment is really powerful, is that it assumes that people can only have their minds changed by gross sexual exploitation. It's Maud's experience of harassment in the workplace, rape, I think, is what we're meant to think has happened. And then the daughter of Violet is following her as the next person. And actually, the testimony that she gives in her voice at the Committee of Inquiry, I think, comes from a book called Women's Work and Wages, about women's work. It's the real thing. And that assumption that you have to have the most gross, direct, personal offences to activate your sense of social justice seems to me, in its way, slightly problematic. And the way we have to fall in entirely with our heroines, I also find slightly problematic. But I do think it's a very powerful film, and I like the way it focuses on that 1 year and a narrative that dramatises the London experience and what people are seeing in the newsreel and the papers. The other thing I don't like about it, and this may be peculiar to me, is the difficulty of watching handheld cameras. It makes me feel incredibly queasy, so it's an aesthetic judgment. But my last point would be to ask what it means to us to watch it now. What do we make of it? Those of us that were in the Guildhall and were listening to an imitation Mrs. Pankhurst give a speech that Mrs. Pankhurst gave, what were we thinking when we thought, this is wonderful, she's so right, this is about justice, it's about fairness, but what are we making of it? What are we doing with it? I'm not quite sure, and I'd love to know what other people think.